Oh my, it's kind of dark, isn't it? Ooh, let me turn on the light there. There, that's a little better. Not so underground. Welcome to another Word of God, friends. Average Folks in the Afterlife number 59. And I think today we'll round off our explorations with Paul Elder in his Eyes of an Angel. And I'm running very close to the possibility of reading the entire book if I don't stop. And I'm sure a lot of you would like to get a copy yourself and read it over carefully. I don't think it's been bettered in the years. It's been equaled. I don't think it's been bettered. There don't seem to be quite as many out-of-body books of original material. There's a lot of smaller books that sort of give you some training advice and some small examples. But as Robert Peterson has shown in his online book review blog of these, a lot of these books are not terribly good. And so I'd advise you to go after the older ones. Ones I've mentioned, they're not impossible to get. They're quite easy, actually. Just because something's been put out in the last 3 years doesn't mean it's better than something from 20 years ago, at least in my opinion. Continuing on with Melder's little talk here. There are millions and many millions of talented spirits with such an intense love of design and innovation. They constantly work at improving their creations both in the spirit realm and in the physical worlds. While in the spirit plane, they continue their endeavors, developing new ideas, solutions, and inventions. It's much easier for them to work from this level where thoughts can be manifest instantly. The more difficult part is in transferring the ideas and knowledge to the physical planes. Many accomplish this through the slower process of reincarnation. But there are countless souls who choose instead to transmit their ideas and innovations directly to the minds of receptive physical beings. There are great numbers of creative people on Earth who make these connections, receiving inspiration during sleep or in altered states. They may not remember or even be aware of their journeys, but the impressions stay with them. This is one reason why people in different parts of the world often seem to come up with the same ideas or patents at virtually the same time. They have been guided. Now, this notion of spirit inspiration of receptive minds on the physical plane has a long history. And it was talked about in the old spiritualist books without a great deal of detail 100, 150 years ago. And writers will often point out the various letters and memoirs by scientists and innovators who said they got their inspiration in a dream. You'll likely be familiar with those. But I would also like to add, and I'll get to this another time, the notion propounded mainly by the English esoterist Cyril Scott in a book from, 100 years ago, no, not quite 100, but 70, 80 years ago, where he spoke in detail with some channeling of the Ascended Masters and their inspiring of the great composers you would recognize. And it's not a particularly accepted theory in the world of classical music as yet, but it does tie in with these thoughts, and I will get to that fairly soon. Maybe even number 60. Melder's revelation has made a great deal of sense to me. In my travels to the other side, I had witnessed many amazing things and was slowly beginning to understand the larger picture. There was no question we are all connected. I wondered where we were. Melder broke into my thoughts. I believe you would call it the Himalayas. Or is it the Himalayas? Some people call it that. You mean we're on the earth plane, I asked. How did you make the chair appear in the physical world? I didn't think that was possible. Oh, it's certainly possible, he replied, but don't forget, at this moment you are not in your physical body. You're in an elevated level of consciousness where these manifestations are visible and real. Yes, two quote unquote ghosts on the physical plane, the more experienced of them can manifest something like a chair, and the newbie will go, my God, that's amazing. And because they're on the physical plane as what we would call ghosts, spirits, it seems more amazing. But it actually isn't. To actually create something on the physical plane, now that takes some time, effort, and concentration. I still come here occasionally, he mused. This used to be a favourite place of mine on a couple of previous incarnations. I always found the energy here very relaxing. I was on the verge of asking Melder to tell me about his lifetimes on Earth when, without warning, I was slammed back into my body. Somehow he finds out in the next couple of minutes that a book that he had been reading fell off the pillow onto his head, and that's what woke him up. So he's wanting to try and reconnect with his guides. And yes, focusing my attention on the spot between my eyes, I concentrated on opening the portal. Soon a small pinpoint of light appeared. I was going to say pinprick. But before I could even react, the aperture flashed open, and a moment later I found myself peering down the hallway of what seemed to be a very long building. Numerous doorways led off to both sides of a wide corridor. The walls themselves emanated a soft, warm green light. White tile floors reflected spotlessly. It had the feel of a hospital. To my left, a wide open doorway was displayed number 17. I wondered if there was any significance attached to the number, but more importantly, I questioned why I had been drawn to this particular place. It occurred to me that perhaps this was the kind of hospital room my mother had arrived in after making her way to the other side. Moving anxiously through the doorway, I half expected to see my mother sitting up in bed waiting for me. To my disappointment, there was no one there. Feeling a small twinge of loneliness, I slowly surveyed the room. It was indeed a hospital. The whole room was bathed in a soft, warm light. Against an adjacent wall stood a standard hospital-type bed made up in soft white linens. A couple of white chairs had been placed on either side of the bed. What struck me as odd, though, was the absence of any medical equipment. But when I thought about it, it seemed reasonable. There was no need for medical equipment here. There were no physical bodies to heal. Hospitals in this realm served only to provide a comfortable transition for those souls who may have died in an earthly hospital environment. This was a natural, peaceful place for newly arrived souls to restore their energy until they were reoriented to the other side. On the right of the bed, a vase filled with beautiful flowers adorned a small round table. Exotic and vibrant, the flowers filled the room with a wonderful fragrance. Enthralled by their form and texture, I carefully examined several of them. They were nothing like I had seen before. A warm breeze drew my attention to a large, partially opened window. Moving across the floor, I peered out. Immediately outside the room was a beautiful garden overflowing with flowers and plants so vibrantly colourful they defied description. The plot extended for what seemed like hundreds of yards, finally giving way to rich green grass of a large valley. A small blue stream meandered through the gorge into the background of a bright green forest covered with snow-covered mountain peaks. I knew this had to be an area of the park, and it probably was. The park is bigger than the average park. Let's put it that way. With a sigh of appreciation, I finally drew from the window and turned back to the room. I could certainly understand how wonderful and peaceful it would be to wake up in a place like this. I wondered about the rest of the building and whether there might be other buildings in the area. Heading for the doorway, I felt a swirl of energy. I passed through the opening. A moment later, I was standing in a beautiful high-walled cathedral-style building. It was massive. At first impression, it seemed like a cathedral, but it was different from any church I remembered. Remembered was the key word. As I stood absorbing the images, a distinct feeling of recognition came over me. I had definitely been there before. Intuitively, I knew that this structure was for revitalizing and tuning soul energy. See the intuition again? Doesn't need to analyze, just knows. Although enclosed by high, sturdy perimeter walls, there didn't appear to be a ceiling over the main structure. Throughout the long, open marble corridors, there were an inestimable number of pillared structures, looking a lot like gazebos. Approximately 12 feet in diameter and 20 feet high, they consisted of 6 marble pillars placed in a circle, supporting a beautiful domed ceiling. The center of each dome contained a massive multifaceted crystal at its peak. Having the appearance of a perfectly cut diamond, each one was at least 4 feet in diameter. In the shape of a child's toy top, they had been set upside down into the roof structure. The crystal peaks protruded through the tops of the domes, while their convex bottoms formed the center of the inner ceiling. The crystals, or whatever they were dazzling. Every one of the hundreds of facets seemed to reflect a different color and vibration. On the floor directly below each crystal stood a large round bed, about 2 feet high and 8 feet in diameter. From my position about 20 feet from one of these structures, I noticed 3 spirits approaching. A middle-aged man and woman seemed to be giving instructions to a younger man of about 20. I watched intently as the youth, dressed in blue jeans and t-shirt, crawled to the center of the bed and lay down. I could sense his uncertainty as he cautiously prayed to God for healing energy and then nervously prepared himself to receive. Within moments, a dazzling field of shivering, multicolored energy cascaded from the crystal, flooding the area below, permeating his body. With a look of surprise and relief, the young man appeared nearly overwhelmed in the bliss of the experience. So intense was the energy infusion that after a minute or so in ecstasy, he floated off the bed. His body began to shimmer and fade from view until only an energy outline remained. Within the form of his now translucent body, I began to notice a row of bright, glowing spheres of light. About the size of tennis balls, they seemed to radiate a swirling power. Could these be the chakras, I wondered? Were these the energy centers that are supposedly contained in every living body? Ever so slowly, the luminous orbs continued to intensify and expand until they finally enveloped each other, becoming a single, glowing oval of energy. The entire spectacle was mesmerizing. The beam from the crystal had begun a process of shifting colors and intensity. Every 30 seconds or so it would blend from one color to another until it had gone through every hue of the rainbow. Finally, having made its way through the color spectrum, the beam subsided, softening to a warm golden hue. The young man's body, now a radiant sphere of energy, slowly descended to the bed below. I had been so engrossed in the scene that I hadn't noticed that the middle-aged couple had left. I glanced around but couldn't see them anywhere. With the process apparently now complete, the crystal energy began to fade and then disappear. The rejuvenated soul lifted off the bed and floated gently to the marble floor. As he landed, he was joined by 2 other light beings who appeared out of nowhere. A moment later, all 3 vanished. Fascinated, I wanted badly to give the crystal a try. However, not being so sure of the effects it might have on someone still occupying a physical body, I decided to let it go for the time being. Perhaps Melder might be able to advise me on it later. I had no idea how much time had passed in the physical world. I remembered that I had removed my headphones, so there was no way to know if the session was over. I decided I'd be better get back into my body, and a moment later, I was. So he's discussing the experiences and with the other team members on the course. And there's further interaction with Melder and probably more experiences, but I think we've had enough. Endless amounts of fascinating things will and can happen depending on your state of receptivity. And although it certainly helps to go to the Monroe or use the Hemisync tapes at home as I did, you don't actually have to. It'll help you overcome your resistance, your subconscious resistance, and, how shall I say, analytical doubt. But it can actually just sort of happen spontaneously on its own. We had a little pause there while I found what I was looking for. And had to go and fiddle about for a while. And I'm still fiddling now. So, spiritualist notions of inspiration and spirits and the astral and mental worlds inspiring open and creative minds here in the physical. This book, now republished with a slightly different cover, I might add, but it's a book of, at least, how many years old? 1933, portrays the notion fairly in depth, and I'll just read little segments here, of the ascended masters, or some of them that are most interested in music as opposed to science or art or religion, fields of human endeavor, have used, how shall we say, occult or telepathic means to influence the minds and hearts and creative spirits of famous composers, at least in the classical realm anyway. And Cyril Scott was a composer and performer himself. If you go to Amazon, you'll see a number of CDs of his music listed there. Some of them very beautiful. And he was in contact with Kudhumi, other masters, for a number of years, in which he wrote inspired works, certainly literary works. Now, I'm not sure how much of his composition was. It might have been. I'd have to check a number of sources on that one. But his work on this matter of some of the ascended masters inspiring composers with sublime music from the higher planes is still a pioneering work. There's not much been done since then. Not that I'm aware of, anyway. So let me just touch on a few things here. Don't forget, this is 1933. A chapter called The Esoteric Source of this book. When some years ago I wrote, from the esoteric standpoint, a book called The Influence of Music on History and Morals, I was faced with many difficulties which time and the trend of opinion have subsequently diminished. During recent years, occult ideas in one form or another have become widely disseminated, and skepticism toward the not immediately explainable or perceptible has ceased to be the fashion amongst the intelligentsia. I think we've seen a resurgence of that of late. Spiritualism has recruited an ever-increasing number of adherents. Some theosophical ideas have been embraced even by non-theosophists. Astrology finds its place in the daily papers. Reincarnation and karma, the law of cause and effect, have been accepted as logical doctrines. And thank God for that. While the higher types of clairvoyance, clairaudience, and kindred faculties are no longer treated as subjects for ridicule and pseudo-sapient negation. I love that phrase, pseudo-sapient negation. Oh. Christianity is also undergoing changes, and the recognition of an esoteric or hidden side to its many pronouncements is ever growing wider. Even science is becoming more occult, even though the scientists themselves object to the term. For the recognition of hidden forces plays an important part in modern scientific conclusions. Again, 1933. And we know what lads get into power in 1933, but I don't suppose Cyril had time to put that in the book. And we know what their attitude to music was it cast out all the new stuff and just go to the romantically pompous old stuff. All this being so, and putting forth this new book, in which, however, I embody such portions of the old as are indispensable to the basing argument, I am enabled to dispense with many of those dissertations on the rationale of occult science itself, which aimed at enlightening the general public, but which could only prove irksome because already familiar to occultists of various schools. For instance, I was constrained emphatically to argue the actual existence of that hierarchy of great sages, initiates, and adepts known as the Great White Lodge. And it was known under the Ascended Masters were known under those terms for many decades in theosophical and occult circles, which exercises such mighty influence on the evolution of mankind. But in the interim, the Mahatma letters to AP Synod have appeared, and also a notable book, Through the Eyes of the Masters, by David Enrius, which testify to the fact that these mysterious sages were not the invention of that much maligned occultist, Madame Blavatsky, but have been and can be contacted by all those who are prepared to develop the necessary, though with difficulty, attainable qualifications. The result, both direct and indirect, of these books and others of a similar trend has been to dispel the feeling of opposition which so often arises in the minds of skeptically disposed people when confronted with ideas or facts with which they are entirely unfamiliar. Always a good arguer. This is partly because ideas floating about, so to say, in the mental atmosphere filter through to the subconscious before they are apprehended by the objective mind. As the psychoanalyst implies, it is not the conscious brain which resists a new idea, but the subconscious, a condition which is altered when forces of thought have been repeatedly impinged upon it, and, like eddies of water in connection with a stone, have worn away its resistance. Consequently, the ground has been prepared for what has been given me to set forth in this new volume. For although in the influence of music on history and morals, I stated unequivocally that I was indebted to a high initiate of esoteric science for all my information regarding the hidden effects of music, I was not permitted to disclose his name, the time not being ripe. The time not being ripe. Nor yet that of the remarkable seer who clairaudiently received the information and passed it on to me, to be expounded and elaborated. Fortunately, however, this injunction has now been rescinded, and I am in a position to acknowledge my indebtedness to the Master Kuthumi, who was my authority for what was previously set forth, and for much added information which follows. The High Initiate, who I may mention en passant, resides in Shigatse, I presume that's India, takes a special interest in the evolution of Western music, a fact which theosophical literature has failed to stress, even though he was one of the two sponsors of the Theosophical Society at its inception toward the end of the last century. Indeed, he considers it advisable that students of occultism of all schools should be more fully appreciative of the great importance of music as a force in spiritual evolution, and to this end he has revealed much that has been hitherto not been revealed, and that cannot fail to prove of paramount interest to all music lovers. Well, I don't know if it was paramount interest to all music lovers. Certainly some, but if you look at the references to Cyril Scott in those sort of biographical dictionaries of composers, you'll see this aspect of his life was referred to without great seriousness. Although I'm sure that will change, but holy smokes, how many hundreds of years is it going to take to change? Here's a little bit called Musicians and Their Higher Powers. As implied in Chapter 5, all high initiates have the power, by means of thought transference, to impress upon the minds of such persons such as are sufficiently receptive, any and all ideas they may think fit. But when we write impress, we use the word in a suggestionistic sense, and in no other. They suggest ideas to the poet, musician, painter, writer, or philosopher. They do not force ideas upon him. Indeed, the recipient is quite often unconscious whence come his inspirations, and has no suspicion that he is, as the case may be, either the subject of thought transference or temporarily overshadowed by an unseen presence. Only when the artist is at the same time an accepted pupil of an adept and in close touch with him, as in the case of Nelsa Chaplin, the medium who did the mediumistic work for Cyril on this book, can know the facts. Now, within comparatively recent years, certain of the masters who specialize in the arts have deemed it expedient to inspire a type of music calculated to augment spirituality by means of knowledge. Through music, man should at least come to sense that the other world with its millions of incorporeal denizens existing concurrently with the physical. We should definitely come to sense that. We refer, of course, to the Deva evolution, those spiritual intelligences ranging from the smallest nature spirit to loftiest cosmic archangel. Since the generality of mankind are not sufficiently evolved to perceive these devas, the power of music was brought into service. As the melodious utterance of the poet will often convince a skeptic of some truth when no amount of dry argument is of avail, so the melodious sounds of music can achieve a similar, nay, even greater result. By inspiring composers to convey the vivid life and movements of the devas, and also their atmosphere and even their music in terms of earthly sound, the masters are enabling man to hear what as yet he cannot see. Moreover, by realizing that the devas exist, man is approaching that closer relationship between himself and them, which is to constitute such an important evolutionary development of the future. And that is indeed true. A little dated in exposition, but I think clear in what he's getting at. And he talks a good bit about the various bodies, the astral, etheric, astral, mental bodies, causal bodies too. And as I say, he talks about various composers. There's a chapter here on César Franck, the bridge between the humans and the devas. And he says quite a lot about these composers, and it's not easy to sort of pull out the more significant parts. But let me just quote this little section on César Franck. Those who, while in the body, can clairvoyantly see the devas, or else bring back memory of them after superconscious trance, know that one of the chief deva characteristics is love. But, of course, this attribute varies with the spiritual altitude of the devas in question. In the little nature spirit, it is existent, but to a correspondingly lesser degree. That a tone poet who was in close touch with the higher type of deva should manifest this same love was both natural and significant. Yet, unless to begin with he had possessed a measure of that beautiful attribute in his soul, it would not have been possible for either adept of deva to inspire him. But apart from Franck's love nature, there are other signs that he was closely in touch with the deva evolution. He was a master of that form of improvisation which initiates know to be the devic type. Moreover, his achievements in this direction were perhaps even more inspired than his written work, and this lends much weight to our contention. For César Franck had, or rather was, the genius of improvisation. In the dusk of the organ loft in that church in Saint Clotilde, where he held post of organist, every Sunday and feast day he would pour out his soul in wonderful fantasias, quote, which were often far more lofty than the many skilled, elaborate compositions. These are quotes, by the way, from biographies. And it is just this spontaneity, this finding expression, which is so evidential of the deva-inspired or the deva-overshadowed man. Franck was an ardent believer, and we read that every Sunday during Mass, quote, he would leave the organ loft and, kneeling in a corner of the gallery, prostrate himself in fervent adoration before the mighty presence at the altar. This simple act of faith on his part is full of meaning to those who, gifted with seership, can perceive the radiant coloured devas as they fill a church, having been evoked by means of that ancient piece of ceremonial magic. It was then, no doubt, that César Franck came into closer touch with those shining ones, whose very speech he so often endeavoured to reproduce in earthly music. It was then that he, quote, assuredly foresaw and conceived the sublime melodies which afterwards formed the groundwork of his Beatitudes. The Theosophist Charles Ledbetter has some interesting work where he talks about his clairvoyant perceptions of angels appearing in various churches that he was present in as the Mass was being said and people were praying. And I might get to that one day. We're slipping away slightly from out-of-body experience, but I just wanted to touch on that. Here's a little bit on Grieg. As Franck was an intermediary between the higher devas and humanity, Edvard Grieg was an intermediary between the little nature spirit and humanity. Although his creations were in many respects charming and individual, they did not reach the altitude chained by the Belgian composer. Nor, in view of what we have just written, could this be demanded. The nature spirits are quaint little entities whose relationship to even the lesser devas merely resembles that of our domestic animals to us. Good point. Ponder on that. And therefore to expect either great loftiness or profundity from their musical interpreter, and their first at that, would be to expect the impossible. Talking about living in Norway, where Grieg did, Grieg lived in close touch with the untarnished soul of man. Oh, sorry, nature. Also, the folk song of that country, which exercised such a marked influence on his work, was already to some extent expressive of the nature spirit element. As the writer in Grove's dictionary remarks, Grieg's music carries the fragrance of his native pine woods into the concert room. Yes, and in the last number of the Peer Gynt suite, he also carries a suggestion of dancing gnomes. And later, introducing Tchaikovsky, the work which Grieg and Tchaikovsky accomplished was more to draw attention to the existence of the nature spirit music by portraying what they thought it was like rather than reproducing it actually. For this, the time was not ripe, seeing that the knowledge of the Deva evolution was not intended for the world until after Wagner's influence had spread to a certain extent. But apart from this, it was not possible that music itself should undergo a sudden transformation at the hands of exponents. For Grieg or Tchaikovsky to have conceived of an entirely new music would have been contrary to the laws which govern inspirational receptivity. However much an adept or deva might wish to impress a totally and consistently novel combination of ideas upon one of his mediums, the latter would be incapable of receiving it. For one thing, it would be contrary to all his previous musical notions. For another, he would not have the necessary technique at his disposal to transmit it. Therefore, musical evolution, just as every other kind of evolution, must be a gradual process, in view of both its composers and listeners. Hitherto, even the most advanced Deva exponents have only been able to bring through a small portion of that music. And that is why the hypermoderns, again, don't forget 1933, sound so discordant to us. They have assimilated some of the discords, but have not learnt to resolve them. Moreover, they still have to bring through the melodic side of Deva music, for not having yet sensed this, many of them, in their endeavours to avoid the obvious, banish melody from their compositions altogether. It should also be stated that the necessary instruments for the perfect interpretation of this music have yet to be invented. The next progressive step from the human to the Deva music is to be found in the works of Frederick Delius, for he has undoubtedly contacted much of the atmosphere of nature spirit evolution. If we compare his art with that of his predecessors, we find it appreciably softer, mellower, and more subtle. It is also essentially refined. Delius, like all other individualists, developed his style through a selective process. He assimilated certain phrases of Grieg, of Debussy, of Wagner, and made them his own. He is the poet of atmosphere, of the peace-fragranced spirit of the woods, of the freedom of the cloud-kissing hill, and of the hazy sun-bathed landscape. And after that, he goes on to talk, guess what, about Debussy and Ravel, who, of course, are nature spirit musicians par excellence. Après-midi d'enfant, for example, La Mer. So enough of that a little bit. Don't want to get you caught up in music theory too much, but just a small example of how the inspiration from other levels manifests in many different ways. And with that, we'll bring to an end our discussion of Paul Elder's book, and we'll move right on in the next couple of days to some more. Because, as they say, there's always more where that came from. So long, friends.